there! Today I'm going to be testing a high-end computer from around 2015 in the top 5 Steam games in 2024. The CPU I am using is the Intel i7-3770K, which was released in 2012, and I am pairing it with a Nvidia GTX 980 Ti, which is the top-of-the-line GPU released in 2015. It's a realistic pairing. The CPU is overclocked to 4.2 GHz. I am using 24 GB of DDR3 RAM at 1600 MHz, 2 4 GB sticks, and 2 8 GB sticks. The boot drive and the game drive are on SSDs, and of course the Nvidia GTX 980 Ti is using the latest Nvidia drivers. Due to thermal reasons, I have limited the graphics card to only 90% of its potential power, although I overclocked it by 125 MHz on the memory clock and the core clock, and the performance of the graphics card is nearly identical, if not slightly faster than stock. The first game I'm testing is the most popular game on Steam. It is Counter-Strike Global Offense 2. And on the low settings, with FSR turned off, the game is getting approximately 108 frames per second on average, with a 1% low of 50. So it is not a 60 plus FPS experience all of the time, but it's very, very close, and it's extremely playable. At 1080p on the medium settings, with FSR again turned off, the game is getting 87 frames per second with a 1% low of 56. So the 1% low is marginally better. It's probably down to margin of error, to be fair, and the average frame rate is down quite a bit, but it still is a very smooth and playable experience. 1080p on the high settings with FSR turned off, the game is getting 91 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 44. It's still extremely playable, but for some reason the average frame rate is higher than medium for some reason, but the 1% low is lower. I don't know what's up with that. And finally, I tested the very high settings, and at the very high settings the game was getting 78 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 48. And again, it is still a very playable experience, although the 1% lows are pretty low. I recommend staying with the low settings. It looks about the same between low and very high, at least to me, but one way or another, any setting you choose, it is playable, which is awesome. PUBG at 1080p on the very low settings was getting 92 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 26. It's quite stuttery, but it is definitely playable. Moving up to the low settings instead of very low, I was averaging 100 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 47. I'm not sure why the low settings are less stuttery than the very low settings. Maybe it's because I was in the game longer. I'm not sure. 1080p medium settings, the game was getting 100 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 34, and at the medium settings I was sometimes GPU bound, but nearly still entirely CPU bound. 1080p high settings, I was getting 93 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 35. I was even more GPU bound on the high settings, which isn't necessarily a bad thing or a good thing, it's just something notable I've noticed. One way or another, the game is still running quite nicely, but it was stuttering still quite a bit. And the ultra settings were even more intensive, giving me an average frame rate of 90 with a 1% low of 46. So the stutters seem to be somewhat random. It doesn't really matter what settings I'm at, the game will just stutter either way, sometimes more, sometimes less. But one way or another, the game is definitely playable. I would stick to the low settings if I were you, but at least it is playable on every single settings preset. Dota 2, I didn't bother trying all the settings, I just whacked it onto the highest possible settings because it's a really easy game to run and you don't need super high frame rates. So on the best looking settings / the highest settings, the game was getting 77 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 44. In some intensive scenes on screen, the frame rate did hover in the low 60s for a while, and overall it was extremely playable. I have seen some cases in Dota where the game was performing like this on a different CPU, but it had some scenarios where it was getting 40 or 30 FPS, so I don't think it's impossible to get 30 or 40 FPS in some intensive situations, but it should be 30 plus all of the time. Naraka, Bladepoint, and Call of Duty had a weird issue. It was artifacting and both games were crashing. Like the entire Windows operating system was artifacting. So I reseated the graphics card, that did nothing. I decided to go and uninstall the drivers with DDU and reinstall the drivers, and that magically fixed it and the games worked properly afterwards. It was quite weird. Call of Duty Warzone at 1080p on the minimum settings was getting 32 frames per second with a 1% low of 25. For a FPS shooter game like this, that is absolutely horrible. You want as many frames as possible, and 30 is barely playable in a slow-paced game, let alone a shooter game. So this is just, it's not good. Now, there is frame generation, that is an option, but with frame generation, it also isn't good. The reason why is you will be getting input lag like you're getting 20 FPS, and it will still feel extremely stuttery, so just stay away from frame generation if you're getting, let's say, less than 45 FPS. Also, do you know how there are different game launchers like Steam, Epic Games, and Battle.net, for example? For some reason, the Battle.net version of Call of Duty actually gets about 50 to 70% more frames per second than the Steam version. So if you want more frames per second, I recommend trying the Battle.net version. It doesn't make sense at all to me why it would run better, but I've seen videos and it runs better. I'll link a video in the description that tests it out. Naraka Bladepoint, I opted for the high settings, and I think I'll just leave it there. It is running at 98 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 11. The game stutters a lot even if it's GPU bound. I thought maybe it stutters just because it's CPU bound, but no, in this case I'm actually mostly GPU bound and it is still stuttering, so I don't know what's up with that. I guess that's just how this game runs. Also, I'm using FSR2 set to quality. I forgot to mention that, but one way or another, it is running amazingly in terms of the average frame rate, and no matter what you're going to do, it's going to stutter anyway, so I'd say it's perfectly playable. And sure, that was 5 games right there, but Grand Theft Auto 5 is number 6, and I would feel bad leaving it out. It is an extremely popular game. It is a very old game. It looks great. It just doesn't make sense not to add it, so this is technically the top 6 games. Either way, Grand Theft Auto 5, I turned off depth of field effects. It was at the very high settings, and the game was getting 99 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 62. It was running amazingly. It was entirely CPU bound, though even around the bush areas, it was still entirely CPU bound. So with quite a few of the games I tested today, with the i7 you can set the resolution to, let's say, 1440p and probably still have a quite nice experience with the GTX 980 Ti. Although some new games like Stalker, Chernobyl, you have no hope of running it on this computer at 30 FPS. Some of the new AAA games, they just are so intensive. Are they even games? No, not really. They're almost just PowerPoint presentations at that point. I'm not trying to pick on them. They just are really, really hard to run. Either way, if this video was entertaining or you got by it, what did I just say? Or if this video helped you, make sure to leave a like. If you're new to the channel and want to see more of these videos, please consider subscribing. If you want to help the channel out, consider becoming a channel member. Either way, thank you very much for watching and have a great day.